Hi, this is Ron Cipcic. In this particular segment of Money in Banking, we're going to take a look at the deposit expansion multiplier process. In our previous lesson, we examined some of the basic principles of bank accounting. When someone makes a deposit into a commercial bank, say Bank A, that deposit is going to create a liability on the right side of the balance sheet and reserves, an asset, on the left side of the balance sheet. And this is the beginning, this is really the beginning of understanding the deposit expansion multiplier process. The idea that any deposit creates reserves, or any withdrawal, which is a negative deposit, destroys reserves or pulls reserves out of the bank. Now, banks do not exist to polish people's silver. Okay, when somebody makes a deposit into a bank, banks are interested in taking those deposits, which create reserves, and then converting those reserves into loans. Now, I'm going to complicate this just a little bit from the last lesson. When that deposit comes in, reserves are created. When Bank A makes a loan, it's actually a two-step process. We'll call the loan transaction Transaction B. Say someone borrows $800 from the bank. If that number is not big enough, just add 3 zeros and say $800,000. So the $800 loan shows up on the bank as an asset. Now, in our previous lesson, I simply withdrew the $800 in reserves in the same transaction. I more or less consolidated two steps. I want to break those steps out now because I want to show you a very, very interesting result. When that loan is made, it actually creates another deposit on Bank A's books. So in essence, this is going to seem very, very weird. Bank A has the ability to create deposits whenever it extends credit. Let me say that again. Whenever Bank A or any bank extends credit, it essentially creates a deposit. Now let us not forget, deposits are money. So in essence, we're going to learn that banks have the ability, in fact, banks create money. If deposits are money, banks create deposits when they make loans. So let me again remind you, this is Smith. In our previous lesson, we used Smith as our initial depositor, and this loan is going to a woman named Jones. But this deposit also goes to Jones. So in other words, when we give Jones a loan, she is going to have funds put into her account. Okay? Now, she doesn't take out the loan to just get a deposit. She takes out the loan because she intends to buy something. So let's continue through the process. And I'm going to draw another dotted line here so I can enter in another transaction. When Jones actually withdraws the $800, so this should be $800 here. When Jones withdraws the $800, we show that withdrawal over here on the liability side. So minus 800 deposit, which is essentially a withdrawal. So Jones gets the loan, receives a deposit of $800, but she didn't borrow the money to hold it. She borrowed the money to spend it. So the minus $800 deposit for Jones creates over here a minus $800 in reserves. Now you can see something very interesting. These two transactions wash, they cancel. Now this is why I skipped them in the first step. But the interesting thing here is that when a loan is taken out, the borrower is given a deposit. They're given funds they didn't previously had. And essentially those funds are created out of thin air. They're created because of the extension of credit. Okay? And then of course when this is all said and done, let's go ahead and move down. We get back to the result we had before. So let me see if I can do this without screwing up the perspective here. You say, well, I'm a little bit confused by what you just said. That's okay. what I just said is rather surprising. You know, one of the reasons you learn new things is they're new, right? And new things at times are going to be shocking. You have probably thought your entire life that it's government who creates money. That is not actually the case. In the United States financial system and in most modern financial systems in the world, it's the banking system who creates money. Now there's a limit to how much money the banking system can create. So if we're going to go beyond that limit, there needs to be some intervention from outside the banking system, and I'll be talking about that in a later lesson. But the point is, banks actually create money. Money is ultimately created by banks, which means deposits are the fundamental type of money in the system. I'll be explaining that more as we go on. So here's Bank A again. Let's just go ahead and consolidate things. So again, those transactions up above, A, B, and C, consolidate into $1,000 in deposits, $200 in reserves, and an $800 loan. And of course, the loan is on the books of the bank as an asset, and that is under Jones's name, and the deposit over here is, no, that's not, is that Jones? Yeah, that's Jones, and then this is Smith. Okay, I got to keep my Joneses and Smiths. Okay, so that's, if you, let me again just scroll it up so you can see it. If you consolidate these transactions, remember these wash. Wash means they cancel. If you consolidate these transactions, you get this final result down here. Okay? Now, we want to take this a step further. You go, no, not today. Yep, today, now. So let's do it. So I'm going to erase some of this, get this out of the way here. All right, what I want to do is I want to show what I've shown so far. Let me back up. What I've shown so far is how a single bank is affected by a series of transactions. What I want to do is I want to expand this out to the banking system. How's the banking system affected by a transaction? This shows how one bank is affected by a transaction. I want to show how a series of banks are affected by a transaction. So here's what I want to do is I want to set up a series of T accounts. So let's go ahead and draw these together. Let's get over in the right settings here. Okay, here we go. Let's try again. So here's my T account, and I don't want red. It's too bold. So I am having technical difficulty. There we go. Okay, now we're going to go to black. We're going to go off eraser back to the marker, and we're going to use the straight function. Okay, so here we go. Did we do it? We did it. So here's one bank. Here's another bank. And let's go move that up. Here's a third bank. So I'm going to tier, lay in steps, if you will, 3 banks. Okay? And I'm going to call this bank A. This is bank B. And this is bank C. Okay? This is going to actually reflect something called the Deposit.Expansion or multiplier process. I'm going to show how a single deposit affects the banking system. Now there's some assumptions I'm going to make in doing this. So let me list these assumptions. One, I'm going to assume there's no currency in the banking system, or there's no currency being used by money holders. So what I'm assuming is all money is in the form of deposits. All money is in the form of deposits. You go, well, that's unrealistic. It is, but it simplifies this a lot. Plus, it's not that far from being realistic. Most money today is not held in the form of paper. It's held in the form of electronic money, which are deposits or bookkeeping entries on the books of banks. All right, so no currency, which means all money, M1 or M2, is in the form of deposits, transaction deposits or saving deposits. Secondly, I'm going to assume, and this is a new idea, I haven't introduced this in the videos yet, I'm assuming that the percentage reserve requirement is 10%. Now let me explain what I mean by the percentage reserve requirement. The Federal Reserve System, which is the U.S. Central Bank, sets a regulation that banks must hold a minimum amount of their deposits as reserves. Let's just assume that it's 10%. It is currently 10%, though it's not actually 10% on all deposits legally. But I'm going to assume it's 10% on all deposits. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. But what it's going to result in is banks have to hold a minimum amount of reserves against their deposits. Okay? So no currency. The percentage reserve ratio is 10%. I'm going to also assume that there are no excess reserves in the banking system. So in other words, I'm assuming, let me rewrite that because that's pretty messy. All of that. I'm assuming that banks loan out all of the reserves they can loan out. So in other words, banks are not carrying any reserves above what they have to carry. So there are no excess reserves. In other words, banks loan out all of the reserves they can legally loan out. Okay? Now let's just go ahead and get going on this, and you'll see what I'm driving at. So let's say that someone deposits $1,000. His name is Smith. He deposits $1,000 into Bank A. Bank A must hold $100 as required reserves. So required reserves are $100. How did I get that? That's 10% of the $1,000 deposit. Notice Bank A can hold more than 100. So up here, let me just go back up here to let me just move up. Say that the percentage reserve requirement is 10%. Well, in this case, Bank A has not fully loaned up because Bank A is only required to hold $100 against that $1,000, and yet it's holding $200. So actually, 100 of that is required reserves, and 100, let me write it down where I pointed to, $100 of that is excess reserves. So reserves break up into two pieces. Required reserves, those reserves that must be held against deposits, and excess reserves, these reserves are what we would call loanable. They're loanable. They can be loaned out. So a bank can only loan out reserves above its reserve requirement. Okay? Now banks do carry excess reserves in practice. This bank, Bank A, is carrying excess reserves because Jones only wanted to borrow $800. She didn't want to borrow $900. So you can't force somebody to borrow money they don't want to borrow. So banks may have excess reserves on hand because lending hasn't been sufficient to get them to the point where they've loaned out all their reserves that they can loan out. All right? It could be that the bank voluntarily chooses to hold excess reserves, and that means that it's acting more conservatively. It wants to make sure it has more reserves on hand in case there's some unexpectedly high withdrawals or in case some of the loans on its books go bad. There could be some reasons why it wants to do that. Okay? All right, so I hopefully cleared up the whole notion of required reserves versus excess reserves. Now back to our regular programming, back to the deposit expansion process. This bank, now I'm going to skip all the intermediate transactions. This bank is now in a position to make what? A $900 loan. Okay, I'm just going to abbreviate it LN, but now there's a $900 loan. So whoever borrows this money, let's just for the sake of argument say that when Jones comes in, she wants to borrow $900. So she wants to borrow all that the bank has available to loan. Well, again, she gets a deposit. I showed you that up above. She gets a deposit when this loan is made, and she's going to spend that deposit. Say that she goes out and buys furniture with those funds, and the bank that the furniture store deals with is Bank B. So the furniture store gives Jones some furniture. The furniture store is paid, and they now receive a deposit into their account. All right? Now this is not Jones any longer. This is the furniture store. The furniture store is depositing the $900 into Bank B. Bank B must hold what? $90 as required reserves, but is in a position to make a loan of what? $810. Again, the person who takes out this loan is going to have a deposit that they can spend. When they spend the $810 that they received when they took out the loan, say they spend it on a very, 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 very used car, I mean a very used car, the used car dealer who receives the $810 will have to deposit that $810 somewhere. Again, remember there's no currency, so we're using electronic money for all the purchases, and so we have to assume that the automobile dealer has a deposit with Bank C. By the way, all these transactions could happen in one bank. I mean, these could all be below Bank A if we wanted. Say it's a small town and everybody banks with one bank. But I'm just breaking them out into separate banks to kind of show you what's happening. Okay? I'm going to move this up to get it a little bit out of the way up here. Now, Bank C receives a deposit of $810. It's got to hold $81 of that as what? Required reserves. It can make a loan of $729, and off we go again. Okay? What we see here is something very, very, very interesting. Here we have a $1,000 deposit, and that deposit leads to the creation of a $900 deposit. This $900 deposit by the furniture store doesn't in any way cancel out the $1,000 deposit by Smith. And this $900 deposit by the furniture store leads to what? An $810 deposit by the car dealership. The point I'm trying to make is when banks extend credit, they actually create deposits. This deposit was created by Bank A when it made that loan to Jones. This deposit was essentially ultimately created by Bank B when it made this loan to whomever this person was here. So the point is, a single deposit in the banking system actually leads to a multiplication or an expansion in the total level of deposits in the banking system. Okay? So this deposit, this initial deposit, this is the initial deposit. This initial deposit multiplies total deposits in the banking system by some multiple of that. We can actually calculate the size of that effect. In other words, we can take deposit 1, $1,000, add it to deposit 2, $900, add it to deposit 3, $810, add it to deposit 4, $729. We can go all the way down here to deposit N, however much that is, and if you add that all together, if you sum these deposits, this was the initial deposit, but if you sum these deposits, this will add up to $10,000. My zero's got a little weird there. It's like a slinky. If you don't know what a slinky is, you should Google it. 0, 0, 0. So this initial deposit impacts total deposits in the banking system by 10,000, potentially. Now this again assumes two things. This expansion, by the way, the expansion is by a factor of 10. I'll show you where 10 comes from. I know it's 10,000 because I know the factor is 10. But that expansion assumes two things. What does it assume? The expansion assumes that there's no currency and no excess reserves. So in other words, banks are loaning out as much as they can loan out, and people are not pulling funds out of the banking system, converting deposits into currency. Because when you pull funds out of the banking system and when people hold currency outside the banking system, the expansion will be smaller than it would otherwise be. Okay? All right, so let me show you, we'll wrap up with this. I want to show you the formula that allowed me to calculate that $10,000. So if you take the initial deposit, multiply it by 1 over the percentage reserve requirement. This thing has got a name. This is called the maximum money multiplier. The actual multiplier is never this large. I'll talk about this later in a later lesson in the next video. The maximum money multiplier assumes no excess reserves and no currency in circulation. Well, banks do hold excess reserves and people do hold currency. So the multiplier in practice, the actual multiplier, is not this large. But right now what we're just interested in is the basic idea, the concept of a multiplier effect. All right, so if you take the initial deposit times 1 over the percentage reserve requirement, you get the total effect on deposits. And I'm talking now about the total effect in the banking system. So let's go ahead and scroll down. I'll write the numbers out for you and you'll have them. So here they are. If you take plus 1,000, which was the initial deposit, times 1 over 0.10. Remember the percentage reserve requirement. Percentage reserve requirement is 10%. 10% equals 0.10. So 1,000 times 1 over 0.10, well that's 10. So that equals, whoops, my hand did that without permission. Back to regular programming, plus 10,000. And again, keep in mind, just keep in mind, deposits are money. Deposits are money. And who creates deposits? Banks create deposits when they extend credit. Which means, get ready, banks create money. Banks create money. Think about it. A currency can't get into circulation. Currency can't get into the hands of the into non-bank entities. You know, you can't get your hands on currency unless you first have a deposit. So deposits. Let me just make a note of that. I just want to let you write that down. Deposits. Third point. Deposits predate or pre-exist currency. Deposits predate currency. So you can't get your hands on currency unless you already have a deposit. So the most fundamental type of money in modern monetary systems are deposits. And when I withdraw, let's say I go to an ATM machine and I withdraw $100 in currency from the ATM machine, what happens? My currency holdings go up by $100, but my deposits at my bank go down by $100, and that has no effect on the money supply. I'm just basically, when I go to an ATM machine and withdraw $100 in cash, I've converted electronic money into paper money. All right, that's enough for today. We don't want your head to explode, so we'll leave it at that. Have a great day.